Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for returning to the room after a very well-deserved coffee break. We've had two splendid plenary sessions, and I am certain that this third plenary session will be extremely invigorating, because we are seeking to analyze one of the most sensitive and difficult topics of the current Middle East agenda, Syria and the regional impact. And ever since we opened this Manama dialogue with the Sky News debate on Friday evening, through William Hague's speech, through these first two plenary sessions, the tragedy in Syria has been very much on people's minds, and the difficulty in developing a coherent and effective approach, not to individual elements in the conflict, but to the conflict as a whole, has been uppermost in people's minds. And there's been interest in the role of actors within the GCC, interest in the role of some of Syria's immediate neighbors, and of course questions about the nature of the debate in Western capitals, and not least in the United States, about the method and means of engaging in the Syria conflict. And that's why the three people that we have on the stage today are the best three people to introduce this discussion and to engage with the audience. And I will invite each of them to speak from the podium in the order that they appear in the program. I'll first briefly introduce them to you. You know them all well. Really delighted to have Khalid bin Mohammed al-Attiyah here for his second Manama dialogue. He came to his first Manama dialogue last year as Minister of State, and here he is at the second Manama dialogue as Minister of Foreign Affairs. So I know the Manama dialogue is a congenial place for him to find himself. I remember at the first Manama dialogue he attended last year, mentioning that everyone was regularly impressed by what I styled the fast power that Qatar demonstrated. And quick as a flash, Khalid Mohammed al-Attiyah said, yes, but fast power is only effective when it's in formation, bringing his experience not just as a pilot, but also as a diplomat to that issue. And it is speed, information, action cohesively that I think people are looking for in the Syria conflict, and we look forward to his words. Senator Tim Kain, Chairman of the Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Near Eastern and South and Central Asian Affairs of the US Senate, was one of 18 individuals in the United States legislative branch that was asked to vote on the question of whether military force might be used to deter future use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime. And there have been many questions asked about that deliberation and about what it signaled of the United States' willingness to use force. And so I think it's important that we have a member of the legislative branch, having heard earlier this morning from a most senior member of the executive branch responsible for defense matters on these issues. And Hoshyar Zebari, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Iraq, a country that is suffering refugee flows from Syria and has a particular relationship with all the countries in the region that are trying to grapple with the Syria question, is a person who can provide also a vital perspective. So with those three introductions, it's really a delight to invite to speak first in this plenary Khalid bin Mohammed al-Attiyah, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Qatar. Podium is yours, sir.
Since I'm in my traditional outfit, allow me to speak in Arabic to deliver the speech. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. أصحاب السمو والسعادة سيد جون تشيبمان الحضور الكرام، في البداية أود أن أشكر مملكة البحرين الشقيقة على هذا المجهود لإنجاح أعمال المعهد الدولي للدراسات الاستراتيجية، ولا بد من الإشارة في هذا المقام إلى الدور الذي يقوم به صاحب السمو الملكي الأمير سلمان بن حمد آل خليفة ولي عهد مملكة البحرين لدوره المشهود به في استقرار ورفعة مملكة البحرين الشقيقة. والشكر موصول أيضا لأخي الشيخ خالد بن أحمد آل خليفة وزير الخارجية على العمل الدؤوب الذي يقوم به من أجل مملكة البحرين ومنظومة مجلس التعاون الخليجي. كما أشكر السيد جون تشيبمان على هذا التنظيم المميز والجهد الواضح لإنجاح حوار المنامة. الحضور الكرام، شهد عالمنا متغيرات وتحولات كبيرة، وما تزال منطقتنا تعاني حروب وثورات تداخلت وامتدت آثارها لتصبح ذات أبعاد إقليمية ودولية. استلزمت تواجدنا اليوم في هذا المؤتمر من أجل التفاكر والتباحث حول المشكلات والتحديات التي تواجهنا. وقد كانت الدروس المستقاة في هذه الأحداث أن انتهاج القوة العسكرية سلاحاً للقتل والقمع والعدوان لن يؤدي إلى فرض الحلول التي تحقق الأمن والاستقرار. على هذا الأساس ينبغي لنا التفكير في تطوير أفكار وأساليب جديدة تتماشى مع ظروف وبيئة ومكونات المنطقة تاريخياً وثقافياً واجتماعياً، ولا بد من السير بمفهوم الأمن من خلال عملية سياسية تشرك أطراف المنطقة وتراعي في مكوناتها التاريخ والهوية والثقافة التي تشكلت بموجبها دول وشعوب المنطقة. فقد كانت أسباب المشكلات توجد في المنطقة، فلا بد من أن تكون الحلول، إن كانت أسباب المشكلات توجد في المنطقة فلا بد من أن تكون الحلول في المنطقة أيضا. نحن في المنطقة كلاعبين رئيسيين، سواء كدول أو تكتلات من خلال مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية أو جامعة الدول العربية، نستشعر أهمية ذلك أكثر من غيرنا لما تحمل المتغيرات والتحولات من آثار مباشرة على منطقتنا. ولذلك لا بد من الإقرار بأهمية الدور الذي يتحتم على دول المنطقة القيام به من أجل المشاركة في صياغة المبادرات الهادفة إلى إرساء الأمن والاستقرار. وفي ضوء عالم متكامل لا بد لنا من الإشارة إلى المسؤولية الجماعية أيضا. وعندما نقول مسؤولية جماعية نعني بذلك توسيع دائرة التشاور والتعاون بين الأطراف في المنطقة والعالم، وبناء جسور الثقة المتبادلة، باعتبار ذلك مسألة جوهرية إذا ما أردنا الخروج بتصورات إيجابية تكاملية تحقق المصلحة المشتركة حول أمن المنطقة، خاصة وأن واقع هذه المنطقة هو واقع مشترك يتأثر ببعضه ويلقي بظلاله على العالم الخارجي. سوريا، في الوقت الذي عجز فيه المجتمع الدولي عن القيام بواجباته تجاه حماية الشعب، تجاه حماية شعب سوريا من آلة القتل والدمار، تحملت قطر مع شقيقاتها مسؤولية الوقوف مع أصحاب الحق وهم الشعب السوري. لقد وقفنا مع إرادة الشعب السوري التزاماً منا بمبادئه الأخلاقية وانطلاقاً من مسؤولياتها الاجتماعية تجاه أمتها. إن مبادئنا تجعلنا لا نستطيع أن ندير ظهرنا أمام أحد أخطر أزمات المنطقة، وسنسعى بكل طاقاتنا مع المجتمع الدولي لإيجاد الحلول السياسية لأزمة الشعب السوري. نولي أهمية كبيرة للجانب الإنساني فيما يتعلق بالأزمة السورية، والذي يجب أن يكون جزءاً لا يتجزأ من اهتمامات والتزامات المجتمع الدولي عند الحديث عن تقديم الحلول ومساعدات الشعب السوري. وهنا نتساءل: ما هو مصير البيان الرئاسي الصادر عن مجلس الأمن في 2 أكتوبر؟ إننا نأسف لعدم تنفيذه. جميع المخرجات الدولية السابقة فيما يتعلق بالشأن السوري لم تتضمن آليات تنفيذ، باستثناء قرار مجلس الأمن بنزع السلاح الكيماوي السوري الذي التزم به النظام السوري، ونرى أن السبب في ذلك هو تضمنه أدوات تنفيذية. تضمن قرار مجلس الأمن بشأن نزع السلاح الكيماوي السوري آلية تنفيذ شاملة ومفصلة وذات جانب تقني، وتحتاج إلى أخصائيين من منظمتين دوليتين، وعلى الرغم من ذلك فإن تنفيذه بدأ على وجه السرعة. وبالمقابل، ومع أن البيان الرئاسي قد اعتمد بعد ذلك القرار ببضعة أيام، وأعني هنا البيان الرئاسي المعني بالظرف الإنساني في سوريا، فإنه لا ينفذ لافتقاده لآلية تنفيذ محددة. وفي مقابل المطالبة بالتنفيذ العاجل للقرار نسمع مطالبات بإعطاء البيان الرئاسي المزيد من الوقت. في الواقع ينبغي التعامل مع الوضع الإنساني باهتمام أكبر لما تم عليه في نزع السلاح الكيماوي، خاصة ونحن في سباق مع الزمن في ظل تضرر البنى التحتية الأساسية وتضرر أغلبية المشافي والمرافق الطبية والصيدلانية الرئيسية في البلد، وقد بدأت أمراض خطيرة بالتفشي لم يشهدها البلد منذ عقود، كما أن فصل الشتاء سيجلب معه المزيد من التحديات والمعاناة. أما بخصوص الاتفاق المبدئي في جنيف فيما يتعلق بالسلاح النووي، لقد رحبت قطر بالاتفاق الذي تم التوصل إليه خلال اجتماعات جنيف وإيران ومجموعة ال5+1 باعتباره يشكل خطوة أولية لحل شامل نحو السلام والاستقرار في المنطقة، وتأمل قطر في أن يسهم في حلحلة مشكلات المنطقة الأخرى. تؤمن قطر بأهمية إشراك دول المنطقة في المبادرات الدولية التي تخص المنطقة، وذلك من خلال التنسيق والتشاور مع الأصدقاء والحلفاء ليكن 5+2. تدعم قطر جهود جعل المنطقة خالية من السلاح النووي وأسلحة الدمار الشامل دون استثناء، وتؤيد فرص ومبادرات حل المشكلات عبر التفاوض بالطرق السلمية. إن من أهم الأمور التي تعقد الحلول في هذه المنطقة هو عملية السلام في الشرق الأوسط. تبقى عملية السلام في الشرق الأوسط في قلب اهتمام دولة قطر، والتي ظلت تؤكد على أهمية تحمل مجلس الأمن الدولي وشركاء عملية السلام لواجباتهم المتمثلة في الضغط على الطرف الإسرائيلي لوقف سياسة الاستيطان ولدفع الطرفين للجلوس على مائدة التفاوض. ما تزال إسرائيل تواصل ممارساتها القمعية وسياساتها التمييزية دون ردع من المجتمع الدولي، حيث تلحق ضرراً بالغاً بمختلف القطاعات الاجتماعية والاقتصادية والموارد الطبيعية والبيئية الفلسطينية، وهو أمر لن يساعد بأي شكل من الأشكال في تحقيق هدف الأمن والاستقرار في المنطقة ولا حتى في إسرائيل. وفي الختام لابد أن أنوه بالدور الذي يقوم به السيد جون كيري من أجل إنجاح عملية مفاوضات السلام، والذي ندعمه به ونتمنى له التوفيق في هذا الشأن. شكرا لكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Minister, shukran jazilan, and thank you especially for recalling that the same international cooperation that applied to addressing the chemical weapons issues should perhaps now be applied in its fullest force to addressing the humanitarian crisis in Syria. Senator, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John, and good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be at my first Manama Dialogue, and I want to thank the Kingdom of Bahrain, the Crown Prince, for the sponsorship of this event over time. It was great to hear Secretary Hagel, one of the original innovators, this morning. I also want to thank ISIS and all the staff who have done the work to bring this together. This is an impressive gathering, and I'm honored to be a part of it. We'll have a chance to do some significant questions about Syria. I want to focus really on one issue and just kind of describe it. When President Obama asked Congress to authorize use of military force against Syria in August to punish the regime's use of chemical weapons against civilians, 100 senators and 435 members of Congress offered opinions. Only 18 of us voted. The 18 of us who serve on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee came back early from a recess, had a vigorous debate, had a vote. By a vote of 10-8, essentially, we came down on the side of using military force. That vote did not need to be taken on the Senate floor or House ultimately, because in the aftermath of that vote, there was the diplomatic opening with Syria to explore the destruction of the chemical weapons. But I want to talk about that vote and what I learned from it. I voted for the use of military force in Syria for a variety of reasons. My reasons are less important than what it says about the United States' posture now, that a vote on that issue was so close. The use of chemical weapons against civilians is not a complicated thing. It is something, an international norm that has been part of international law since the 1920s. Why was a vote on that so close? And I want to just describe that briefly, and then we can, in the Q&A, offer other dimensions. First, the atrocities in Syria, because of the horrific crimes of the Assad regime, do call on the sympathies of every person in the world. And military action is not the only thing that is needed. First, there is a significant humanitarian crisis, and I very much appreciate the point that was made earlier. If we've acted diplomatically on chemical weapons, can't we act with the same degree of international passion to make sure that humanitarian aid is sufficient and gets to where it needs to go? The United States is the largest provider of humanitarian aid to Syrian refugees. We will provide more. But we do feel like we do need to act more in concert with other nations to make sure that the international community can enforce the distribution of aid over the obstacles currently being imposed by the Assad regime. Second, the United States is active in vigorous diplomacy, first surrounding the destruction of the chemical weapons stockpile, one of the largest stockpiles in the world, not even really declared. There had been efforts since 1992 when the Chemical Weapons Convention was updated to get Syria to become part of that convention. The destruction of a chemical weapons stockpile of this size in the midst of a civil war is no simple thing. It's a significant accomplishment. It does change the equation to some degree on the battlefield, but more broadly, the destruction of this stockpile is an important factor in the safety of the region going forward. But let's set aside diplomacy, Geneva II starting in January, and that's going to be critically important, and humanitarian, and now just talk about military. Because to the degree there has been frustration, I know, with the United States with respect to Syria, it's largely been around the question of the United States' support or lack of support for military support for the opposition to the Assad regime. And as somebody who participated in that debate and vote in August, I just want to offer my thoughts. Much about Syria is complicated. The humanitarian crisis, though, is simple. And Americans are sympathetic people. When there's a humanitarian crisis, we have a natural sympathy. When there's a typhoon in the Philippines, we act immediately, and the American public wants us to act. But when it comes to the use of military force, and particularly military force in this instance, even to support a proposition as clear as you shouldn't use chemical weapons against civilians, in Congress, it was a tough vote. It was a challenging vote. Why was it tough and challenging? It was tough and challenging because of what members of Congress were hearing from the American public. I voted for the use of military force, but I will be honest, the calls from Virginians, one of the most military states in the country, into my office were overwhelmingly against the vote that I cast, suggesting that we shouldn't use military force even in support of that principle. And I think it's important to try to understand why, because these reasons have answers, but it helps us to understand what they are. Last night I was on the opening debate panel about issues generally in the region, and a friend on the panel said, used the phrase war weariness in the United States. And that is a phrase that has some traction and some meaning, and yet it can obscure some more specific emotions that I want to describe briefly. What was it about that vote, and what was it about the American public's reaction that made the vote so close? I think there are four elements that made this a close vote, a difficult proposition at that moment in time. First, there is a skepticism in the American public about whether American military action in this region, in circumstances like this, can make a positive difference. It's not a skepticism about our military. It's not a skepticism about their valor and their capacity. It's a skepticism about whether military action, particularly as opposed to humanitarian or diplomatic, can actually move the needle, can change the circumstance for the good. And the American public is skeptical about it. And it's not just the American public. I was with some of you 3 weeks ago at a security conference in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and global polling of 20,000 individuals in 24 countries on all continents of the world had just been done by a polling organization of international credibility. And they discovered across the globe a skepticism about engagement in military activity along the lines of, we're not sure that it will accomplish good. There is a sense that it has to be done on occasion, that justice requires it on occasion, but really regardless of country and regardless of economic circumstance, there's a skepticism about whether military action can promote a positive outcome. So those of us who think that military action has a place in a particular challenge like Syria, the burden is on our shoulders to demonstrate that it can have a positive outcome. Second, a peculiarly American concern that was expressed in connection with the Syrian vote, which is essentially a subset of the first, is will our action, will our engagement at a military level, providing military support, be appreciated? Will it be appreciated? Will it be valued, or will it be devalued? This is not just a matter of kind of will folks like us if we do it. It is also a subset of that question of if it's not appreciated, then maybe it's not that valuable. Maybe it doesn't make the difference that it should. The United States has experience in this regard that's recent experience. Many years of investment in Iraq, in our treasure, but in our time and our resources, in the lives of our young people. At the end of military activity in Iraq, the United States was willing to stay under some capacity, the military, to provide some services or support for reconstruction going forward. That was not desired by the Iraqi people or government. And that was their right to say that, no, let's make a clean break, you should be elsewhere. And yet, we derived a message from that. We're now engaged after 12 years in drawing down our forces in Afghanistan and in trying to negotiate a status of force agreement post-2014 with the Afghanistan government. We get a sense from the Afghan people and from many of the leadership class that they would desire us to remain in some capacity, but the current president of Afghanistan is prone to using phrases like occupiers to describe the American military. And again, the American public draws a lesson from that. Is our active military presence and engagement desired or not? And that feeds back into the question of whether it's likely to do any good or not. A third important question for the United States in wrestling with Syria is, will we have partners or not? How many partners will we have? The more partners, the more validation. The more partners, the more likelihood of success. When the president stepped out and said, we will use military force to enforce this international norm, there were partners. But there were partners that I could count on the fingers of one hand. There weren't other nations stepping forward for the proposition that use of chemical weapons in this circumstance was wrong and wrong enough to justify military action. And finally, the question, and I think this one will be a significant one. I had a very strong meeting with leaders of the Syrian opposition this morning. One of the great features of this dialogue is the opportunity to have these bilateral discussions, John. But the last question that we wrestle with is, the regime of Assad is horrible. What's the alternative? And many of the questions that were posed and many of the reasons elaborated by my colleagues who voted against military action were largely along the continuum of we can't trust the opposition. A very prominent voice in the Senate on the Republican side, although this is not a partisan issue, the vote was not partisan at all, but a very prominent member critiqued President Obama for wanting to use military force against the Assad regime and said, why would you, through airstrikes, try to become al-Qaeda's air force? That was the phrase that was used by a member of the Senate on the Foreign Relations Commission to vote against military action. Now, that's my description of sort of why it was close, but I think these 4 questions are questions that we will always be wrestling with in the United States now around the questions of military engagement. Can we make a difference? Will our actions be appreciated? Will we have partners? And what's the alternative? Those are questions that don't apply just to Syria, but will probably apply to our analysis of any situation that would require use of the American military force. Each of those have answers. Each of those can be answered. There are circumstances that would compel a positive answer to all those 4. But if those of us in policy positions cannot provide the answers, we will face a skeptical public, as we did, and a skeptical vote, as we did in late August. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Senator, thank you very much. That was a very crisp presentation, and it bordered on the announcement of the Kain doctrine for the use of military force that now appears to have 4 elements, which if a significant number of those 4 elements are absent, then the possibility of mustering public support for military action may be absent. So I think people should take note of those 4 elements and see if they persist as the de facto Kain doctrine on the future of military force in general as potentially deployed by the United States. But that was, I think, the clearest statement I have heard on the nature of the debate inside the United States legislative branch, and I think it is something that was important to air. Hoshyar Zebari, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Iraq, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you, John, for having us on this panel, and also I want to thank the government of Bahrain, the Kingdom of Bahrain, and our host for having us to this important dialogue. And really I'll confine my remarks to Iraq perspective on the Syrian crisis and the regional impact of the ongoing crisis on Iraq and on its neighborhood. As you know, for us in Iraq, Syria is an immediate neighbor. We have a common border of 600 kilometers. There are strong familial, tribal, social, and cultural relations between the 2 nations. And also, we in Iraq have suffered a great deal from the Syrian regime behavior in the past and its support for suicide bombers and terrorists slipping across the border into Iraq. And we know that the Syrian people legitimately rose up against their government, as the case with many other Arab countries that witnessed the Arab Spring. And their goals, their aspirations were legitimate, and we wholeheartedly support them. But the situation has changed to the worst when the conflict has been militarized completely. I mean, by the use of force or the excessive use of force, including chemical weapons, against the Syrian people, and the restoration of the opposition also to defend itself, to use as much force as possible. We in Iraq from the beginning really read the situation that there has to be some political settlement of this conflict. The longer this goes on, the worse it would be, both in terms of security threat as well as humanitarian impact on us. Especially, we were going through a transitional period of trying to reestablish ourselves, to enforce our institution, to improve services, security. So this new conflict on our doorstep will definitely have a devastating impact. And our assessments were correct, really. We are suffering a great deal from the spillover of this conflict on our security and on our borders. What has complicated the situation was the polarization, the division within the international community and the Security Council. We knew that the Security Council was unable to take any unified position because of the Russian position vis-à-vis the European one. And there was a lack of international consensus. The conflict, in fact, moved from being a local conflict, a Syrian conflict, into a regional and also an international conflict. And the sectarian feeling and divisions within the region has been deepened by this conflict a great deal, something that we fear most than anybody else in the region. Now, we in Iraq tried from the beginning with our Arab colleagues at the Arab League really to have some Arab peace initiative to try to resolve and address this crisis. And we had an initial success, but then really that initiative died down. Again, we reached out both to the Syrian regime and to the opposition to find some kind of dialogue, to some kind of resolution of this, suspension of hostilities, anyway, really, but our influence was limited. And primarily because of the division, because of the coalition of forces between the two camps in the region. And here we were caught in the middle, between Iran, between the United States, between the GCC, between Turkey, and really to sustain our position has been one of the most difficult for us to hold on to. And Steve Hadley knows that very well, you see, so he's just nodding. Now, I think one of the positive things that has come out of experience after all the other calculations have failed. I mean, many countries banked on the possibility of a military or a direct military intervention in Syria. Our reading from our experience in Iraq and the withdrawal of US troops, really we advised our Arab colleague from the beginning that this is highly unlikely that this will happen. And some colleagues who are here remember those discussions that really the situation has changed. The United States has changed. Europe has changed. So therefore, when Assad used chemical weapons and there was no action, I think there was a great deal of frustration that really we are living in a new world, in a different world. That who would have imagined, you see, some 5, 6 years ago that a regime could use chemical weapons and the world would stand by. Secondly, I think that the international division really was another impediment to seek any resolution. We tried very hard, both with Russia, with China, with the United States and others to create some international consensus, but it happened only after the chemical disarmament when that consensus was reestablished. And we participated last year in Geneva I talks, actually, that produced the famous Geneva document. We think that that was the framework that could satisfy many people, could provide a political framework or a process, but whether it will lead to a resolution of the conflict or end the conflict, really this is an open question. But at least I think both the Syrian regime and the opposition should be positive, and we urge the opposition, really, you should be more positive and constructive to sit down on the same table with the representative of the regime that will legitimize you, and really you can negotiate the withdrawal of Bashar al-Assad from politics, or to seek a parliamentary regime instead of a presidential regime, whatever. But now, this really is aspirations and hope. But the one thing everybody now believe that the only way for some resolution is to support and help Geneva II, which now we have a date if it would be held by all the sides. And the most important danger coming out of the Syrian conflict for Iraq and for the GCC also, and for the region, is the mushrooming of terrorist groups and fronts in Syria. We are not talking about hundreds. We are not talking about several fanatics and so on. We are talking about thousands. Estimates talk about 12,000 ISIS recruits, about 25,000 for Al-Nusra Front. These are armies of recruits of international dimensions. They are not all Syrians. They are European nationals. Some of them have come as far as from Australia, from Canada, and from many other countries. Now, this is really toxic. And the day will come, God forbid, when they will have another Islamic Emirate outside the control, non-governable areas, and then we have to deal with that threat later on. These are facts. I mean, we are not creating stories. I was one of the Iraqi officials who argued with President Bashar al-Assad in 2004-05. Mr. President, you are holding the snake by its tail. It could bite you. So we know actually what is going on and what's happening, but this is an existential threat really to any country that cares about democracy, about human rights, about their way of life. Now, there are many questions about Iraq's position, as if Iraq is supportive of Bashar al-Assad or the Ba'athist regime. In fact, I can declare here, Iraq and the Iraqi government is no fan of Bashar al-Assad. And will not shed any tears if the Syrian people, the Syrian opposition or the Syrian people will change him through the way it seeks. We respect the will of the Syrian people to decide to choose whoever they can govern them. And we have a great deal of respect of the Syrian opposition, from the coalition, from the Syrian Free Army, who are nationalists, who are true patriots, who want to save their country. But really we have deep differences with the other terrorist group, which have not been mentioned at all or even stopped by. Many of them are going there for religious duties, not for terrorist attacks. Some of the fronts have unified the front between Iraq and Syria to make it one single front, the ISIS really, which is Al-Qaeda. We are not talking about these names. They are part and parcel of the Qaeda ideology. And there are some questions about Iraqi position as if we are sending troops or supporting Bashar al-Assad and so on. I can declare really that the Iraqi government doesn't have any forces or any troops. And there could be Iraqi recruits on both sides of the front. On the extremist Al-Qaeda and Nusra ISIS fronts, and also on Liwa Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas on the Shia side. But these are individual, really, initiatives, not sponsored by government or enhanced and so on. The other thing, as if Iraq is helping to assist Bashar al-Assad with supplies of arms and airlifts, or not to interdict overflight from Iran to Syria to supplies. We have been faced with this question by many of our friends in the United States, in Europe, and in the region. Really, this is not the policy of Iraq, and we have issued demarches to the Iranians that we are not party to the conflict. We do not support any sides to provide any weapons to either side of the conflict. But again, as I'm speaking to many professional military commanders and and national security experts, really it's a question of capacity. Iraq doesn't have a single fighter plane now, up to now, as we speak to you. So when we are asked sometimes about some issues we are incapable, really we have to face it. We are asking to buy weapons from the United States, from Russia, from others, but really Bahrain has a more powerful air force than Iraq and any other country. Now, also Iraq really is not providing any oil or any money whatsoever to sustain the Syrian economy to survive. But we fear, because of the impact, because of the spillover that is coming across the border, that affect us, also in terms of sectarian really, impact. The one country that would be affected more than any others is Iraq. Now, Turkey could be affected in other ways by the Kurdish dimension, Lebanon because of its fragile composition, Jordan with different ways, but we are at the line of the fire in this conflict. So that's why really we have been supportive of the holding Geneva II. We will be there and we will try to do our best. And also by maintaining equal distance relations with the regime, with the government and with the opposition, we could be of some help to bring peace and stability in the region. Thank you very much.
Minister Zebari, thank you very much for, again, an extremely clear and very important statement on what the official policy of Iraq is in respect of the Syrian troubles and indeed what the impact is on the Iraqi state if these terrorist groups continue to proliferate as they have done. I already have 8 or 9 people who have asked for the floor. Do it the same way. Put your badge in and press the button. And I think it's important that we hear first from someone from the Syrian opposition, and I would like to invite Mohammed Abkik, Chief of Staff, whose mic is now on. Please take the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to speak on behalf of the Syrian Coalition of Opposition. My name is Munzer Akbek. I am the Chief of Staff of President Ahmed Jarba. First of all, I would like to point out that at the time that we were having our opening dinner last night, at the same time exactly, dozens of people, around 60 people, has been burned and torched to death in An-Nabik city north of Damascus by Assad regime forces. In the same city, Iraqi militias tortured an old man to death on the same day yesterday. Those massacres have stopped to be headlines since some time now. But they are happening every day. War crimes and crimes against humanity described recently by United Nations as a decision being taken by the highest ranks of Syrian government of Assad. And as the international community now is preparing for Geneva talks, which we have committed to attend on the basis of Geneva communique that was issued on 30th of June 2012, and also repeated and endorsed by United Nations Resolution 2118, it looks like that still it is not of very much concern of international community that the death toll is now hundreds of thousands, and the refugees are over 3 million in the neighboring countries, and people who lost their homes are over 5 million inside Syria. There are also, as we speak today, regarding the regional concerns, the regional concerns regarding the Syrian crisis. I would like to point out that there is a regional country, who is Iran, is sending all the support in men, weapons, and money to Assad regime, helping him slaughtering his people into submission. The Iraqi militias are influenced by Iran, sent over in Syria, and the Hezbollah militias of Lebanon also, they are fighting the Syrian people on our soil. These actions, foreign armed groups entered Syrian soil, killing Syrian people, still not being pointed out in the international community in the way that it should be addressed. I would just like to say again that there are more than over 100 countries now in the world who are friends of the Syrian revolution. We appreciate those efforts, the help of those countries for the Syrian people's struggle for freedom and democracy. I know that many delegates here in this room are representing the friends of the Syrian people countries. I would like to for the help that we got. And at last, I want to say that the Syrian opposition is committed to a democratic future for Syria. We want a political transition of power that will lead to a new government that is democratic, with a rule of law, that respects human rights. And this is something that we need the help of all international community to be achieved. For us, the Geneva conference is a diplomatic solution. It could be a diplomatic solution, subject that it should be provided with the leverage that is needed. We know that Assad only respond to threat of force. He was forced out of Lebanon in 2005. He was forced to deliver his chemical weapons. And I think that the international community should play a very important role into pushing Assad out of power in order to solve this problem. And I don't think there is any other solution than a real and genuine transition of power according to the Geneva term. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. That was important to hear, and thank you for your statement. And could I just invite now, right in front of you, from the Kingdom of Jordan, the former Deputy Prime Minister, Ayman Safadi.
Thank you, John. The title of the session is The Regional Impact of the Syrian Crisis, and I think 4 countries, in addition to Iraq, which is represented on the table, Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan are the countries that are most affected. And the impact of the crisis on the region really varies from the proximity of one country to the other. If you talk about Jordan, for instance, we're talking about 1 million Syrians who live in Jordan now. Beyond that, we're talking about within 2 hours from Amman, there are 11 million Syrians on the border who, in the event of the state failing, will be in enormous need of electricity, of food, of hospitals, of education, all of that. There's the threat of terrorism, that many parties have tried to hijack the noble cause of the Syrian revolution, and that's the threat that's not going to be posed to Syria alone. It's going to be a threat that's going to haunt every single one of our nations. Thing is, 3 years into the Syrian revolution and over 100,000 Syrian people killed, I think we're beyond describing and making statements. I think we're beyond arguing whether Assad is a killer or a murderer or not. That has been established. I think we're beyond arguing whether that conflict is going to have a nightmarish impact on the region or not. That is established. I think the question is, why did we fail in helping the Syrian people in what was initially a revolution against tyranny that is now being unfortunately manipulated by everybody in the region and beyond? Why did we fail? Is it because we were too late in reacting? Is it because some countries that really approached the problem had no idea what kind of situation they're getting into? Is it because some saw in it an opportunity to claim the high moral ground and seek a role? Why is it that we fail to help? And I think in addressing why we fail to help, The question now, should be going beyond just making such statements and look, what is it that can be done to salvage what's left of Syria? There is Geneva 2 now in the horizon. Can we go as an international community, as a regional power? Can we go with a roadmap? Can we go with an end game that we will work all together on trying to implement? I think it's clear by now that there's not going to be a military resolution of the conflict, at least in the near future. That means more destruction of Syria. That means risking turning Syria into post-Saddam Iraq minus 150,000 American troops and the wealth of oil that helped rebuild the country. And of course, the fact that in Iraq you had experienced political parties in the opposition, like the parties Mr. Zebari represented, that knew how to navigate the international waters and get their country saved. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to go with a solution, a political solution that everybody agrees on now that needs to be the way? Are we going to be talking to the Russians, talking to the Iranians, talking to every regional player and say, what is it that we can go, and then go and force a solution on Assad and say, these are your options.
Amen.
That's just one point. And one last point, John, if I may. When we talk about humanitarian, what are we doing to help the millions of refugees? We hear a lot of statements, but I think a lot of the countries are left on their own to try and address the minimal needs. We hear a lot of statements, but we see no effort, and that is where we can put our money where our word is.
Thank you so much. And from the UK, from the ISS, Toby Dodge.
Thank you, John. I have a question for Foreign Minister Zebari. I just wanted to pick up on the theme of your talk, the extent to which the rising tide of violence and civilian casualties in Iraq is driven specifically by the spillover of the conflict in Syria, or is actually driven by Iraq's own internal conflict, triggered by the departure of former Finance Minister Isawi from the cabinet. Now, if it's the former, if it's Syria, what's the danger of the two conflicts being united? And if it's the latter, the domestic political problem, will that be sorted out by the elections next year?
Thank you. And from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Professor Al-Mani.
Thank you very much, John. I really appreciate all the panelists today, particularly His Excellency Zebari's very clear notion that the government of Iraq cannot really control its own, I mean, not the people that go into Syria, particularly Fadl al-Abbas and other groups go into Syria. My question to Mr. Zebari, being also the foreign minister of the government of Iraq, what's the position of the Iraqi government vis-a-vis this notion of creating a Western Kurdish state in Syria, whereas we heard from the United States just about 2 weeks ago that the US is against the fragmentation of Syria and creating any other small entities on a sectarian or even small sub-nationalistic groupings. What's the position of the government of Iraq on that? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Francois Aisbourg.
Yes, thank you very much. My question is to Minister Attiyah, and it is also about Syria. Now, a year ago at the Manama dialogue, a representative who was speaking for the Qatari government stated at the time the need to provide arms to all insurgent groups in an inclusive manner. And in the subsequent debate, it was specified that this would be the case whether or not they are affiliated with jihadi movements, that this is something which would be sorted out after Bashar would have fallen. And secondly, that amongst those arms deliveries, there should be also sensitive man-portable air defense systems with SAM-16 Stingers and Mistral being specifically cited. Now, is this the current policy of Qatar? Has that policy changed, and if so, why?
Thank you very much. We'll take a couple more before coming to the panel. And could I have from the Islamic Republic of Oman, Dr. Syed Sajapur, please? Iran.
Thank you very much. As I listen carefully to the panel, I think two consensuses out of the Syrian crisis coming very clearly. One is that there is no military solution to this conflict. This is very important, and actually I was impressed by what was referred to last year presentation here that militarization was the key. Now everybody is saying that the political solution is the key, and I think it's a welcome. The second consensus is this terrorist issue that everybody is talking about, and I think these are conceptual achievements for everybody in the region and world. Now the question is, can there be more consensus on a very specific dimension, and that is this terrorist threat, and is there any concrete international or regional thinking or design about preventing this terrorism spreading toward all countries in the region? And we heard from distinguished Minister of Foreign Affairs of Iraq how Iraq is impacted. I think the region is going to be impacted, but it seems that there is no such thinking. Can we think of a regional or international way in which this huge number of people who are coming and making these crimes can be contained and make the situation more suitable for a political solution?
Thank you. Could I invite now from the UAE, Dr. Al-Tebdi, please, go ahead.
Thank you, John. I'm going to
one question.
Comment in Arabic. Not just a comment, John.
Yeah.
المفارقة في المأساة السورية تحول من معالجة المرض الأساسي، إزالة نظام أسد مجرم، إلى مكافحة الأعراض وهي الجماعات المتطرفة. وبالتالي يعني والآن تحولت إيران إلى شريك في محاربة الإرهاب، بينما هي أحد أسباب الإرهاب، وتحول نظام الأسد إلى شريك أيضا. وغض النظر عن الجماعات السياسية، الشبكات السياسية العسكرية الإرهابية الشيعية التي ترعاها إيران، وفقط لصق الأصولية والإرهاب بالتطرف السني وغض النظر عن التطرف الشيعي. تم تجميد القنبلة النووية عبر الاتفاق النووي، ولكن تم تغاضي عن القنبلة الطائفية في المنطقة التي ازدادت وتيرة العنف في العراق وسوريا بعد الاتفاق النووي.
Thank you. And the last question from Dr. Dana Allen.
Thank you, John. To Senator Kain, you comprehensively preempted the question I wanted to ask about the dynamics and the meaning of the congressional deliberations. When you laid out the four questions or criteria that you think were running through Congress people's minds. But since you voted in favor of military action, I just wanted to ask you, how did you answer those four questions? Did you see American strikes against Syrian targets as leading to positive consequences beyond what was eventually achieved in the chemical weapons agreement? And this question is not meant at all sarcastically. It was a serious question. Did you think that sometimes American military force has to be applied for morally symbolic reasons?
Thank you very much. Well, I know there are 5 other people asking the floor, but there are bilaterals that will be taking place starting in about 15 minutes. So I'd like to ask our panelists to respond to those collection of questions. And I think I'll take them in this order, if I may. I'll ask Senator Kain first, Khalid from Qatar second, and close with Hoshyar Zebari, because there might be a need for Tim Kain to leave just before everything is perfectly wrapped up. So, Senator Kain, could I give you the floor first?
Yes, and let me just take that last question, the one directed to me. I have thoughts on some of the others, but I'll just go right at the last question. The 4 inquiries that were running through committee members' minds as we cast that vote, just to remind folks, were, can U.S. military action make a difference? Would our involvement be appreciated? will we have partners? And finally, what's the alternative? What might it produce, and are we comfortable with that? I voted for military action in this instance, and the way I kind of grappled with these questions is, can we make a difference? I believed we could without getting into sort of classified material about what strikes were going to look like. I felt like we could, as the United States, engage in a targeted set of strikes that would punish the regime for using chemical weapons and deter them from using them in the future. That was the mission. Now, there were some on the committee that were voting for military action because they were primarily focused on regime change. I really was voting for military action to do exactly what the president described. There has to be a consequence. There has to be a punishment for using chemical weapons against civilians. It's one of the few international norms that has been upheld in a significant way since the 1920s. And I felt like we would be able to make a difference and to make the regime realize that any future use would be unacceptable. For my status, voting in that reason, the diplomatic opening that was created after we said we would be willing to use military force, it changed Syria's calculation, it changed Russia's calculation, and they came to the table and said, okay, let's get rid of the chemical weapons. That deal and the actual destruction of the chemical weapons accomplished what I was hoping to accomplish through my vote, in fact, even more so, to take the chemical weapons out of the equation. Would we be appreciated? Yes. Removing the use of chemical weapons from the field would be appreciated by those in the civil war, certainly, because if Assad had been able to use chemical weapons with impunity and evidence was suggesting his uses were getting more and more extreme, that would have been a knockout blow that the Assad regime would have had to use these weapons with impunity. So removing them from the field, certainly appreciated by the combatants and the Syrian civilians immediately, but also by regional partners who would have much to fear from a chemical weapons stockpile down the road. Will we have partners? We didn't have the partners to satisfy me at the time I cast a vote, but I remember saying to the committee, there's not a lot of people standing up for it now, for the proposition that you can't use chemical weapons against your own people. I worry that if the United States doesn't stand up for the proposition, no one will. But I think if we do stand up for the proposition, others will join us. They weren't necessarily there yet, but I felt like others would join us. And finally, that question of what's the alternative continued that was a vexing question, not an easy one to answer, and we're obviously still having a challenge answering it. So it was more than a vote to use force in a symbolic way. I also believe the point that was made that there's no military solution here. It's a political solution. Removing chemical weapons from the field of battle is a promotion toward a political solution, because the use of chemical weapons is a military knockout punch. If you remove those from the equation, you do get into more of a stalemate that promotes the necessity of a political solution, in my view. So that's how I sort of worked through those at the time.
Thank you very much. Minister of Foreign Affairs of Qatar.
Thank you, John. I'll just touch on Francois' point. Let me make it clear that the terrorist group is not the Syrian people, and Qatar support only the Syrian people. When we started encouraging our colleagues and friends to stand by the Syrian people and support them at that time, no such group was there yet. To speak about this group, we need to have more than one session, John, and to describe who they are. Unfortunately, we've been caught by this tactics by the regime, where we are getting our information and based our mindset through what he wants to feed us in the press and the public. It's nice to be sitting here in a cool and discuss such issue, but the miserable condition of the Syrian people today is because the international community. I'll give you an example. Yesterday or the day before yesterday, there was a resolution issued by the Security Council in Central Africa. It's fine, it's good. We all support of this. But it's only took 2 days. 100 killed in Central Africa, which we pay our condolence to. But there is 130,000 Syrians being killed. You meet people in the street, you meet Syrian people that they just came out from their house and they have received a barrel of explosive over their head. It's not a bomb, it's not a 1,000 kg modern laser guided bomb, it's a barrel, a conventional made human barrel being thrown by a helicopter over their homes and house. So if you trace what Qatar was saying last year, the speed of events, by the way, is so fast in Syria. And if we don't promote prompt action, then things will change. But let me again assure you, I don't want to make it long, let me assure you that we never supported terrorists. Qatar still have the same position. We would love to have the international community come and help the Syrian people. If not, we would love our Arab leagues comes and help them. If not, we want our GCC brothers to help. If not, Qatar will remain helping the Syrian people. Thank you very much.
Hoshyar Zebari.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions from Toby Dodge, who is a good researcher on Iraq and has been following Iraq for many years. In fact, what the recent surge of violence or terrorist attacks in Iraq has not all come from Syria. Yeah, there are some of our own failures. Definitely, we had to do a better job on security. But the Syrian conflict has a powerful impact, actually, on the transit, the move of terrorists, of recruitment, and of suicide bombers also coming from abroad through the joint Iraqi-Syrian borders. But not everything we attributed to the Syrian conflict, actually. We have our own responsibilities, too. As for the election, one thing you have to admire as Toby, that we have held or we have implemented what we pledged over the last 10 years to hold every elections on time. And this is the fifth or the sixth elections that will take place next April, after all the Iraqi leaders, politicians, parliamentarians have agreed on a new election law, which is an achievement. So I hope it will change. Definitely it would be up to the people of Iraq to change their leaders, their government, and this has become a way of life for us, really. I mean, there are no sensitivities whatsoever. This year only, we had two elections, one local elections for all the Iraqi provinces and another regional election in Iraqi Kurdistan that went very peacefully, and there are many changes in both elections. So this is my answer to Toby's question. As on the second question, on this Kurdish entity or state that is being created in east of Syria, I don't know. We have some experience in dealing with the Syrian regime and intelligence that goes back for many, many years. And that's why I think we have a better understanding than many people who judge Syria. The regime is a past master of every technique in the world, really, to sustain itself in power. So, I mean, the increase of the jihadists, even this attempt by some Kurdish groups to declare a Kurdish part of Syria an entity, believe me, they are not innocent. And the party that advocates this is very closely associated with Bashar al-Assad regime. Very, very closely associated with Bashar al-Assad. This doesn't mean that the Kurds doesn't have sympathy with their fellow brothers across the border in Syria and elsewhere, but really this is one of the survival tactics also that they are trying to sustain themselves. Now, I think this one, on what the Syrian representative mentions actually about the Iraqi militias, I mentioned that I don't have any problem for calling on Hezbollah, on militias, but also a call on foreign fighters, on terrorists in Syria also to leave. I think in that case we will be even-handed and fair, let's say, and leave for the Syrian honorable oppositionists or people, let's say, to decide their fate, not to be decided by some fanatics elsewhere. Thank you.
Shukran jazilan. Thank you very much to an extraordinary group of 3 people who've made very important presentations, to you for engaging in this dialogue. We've had a very stimulating morning. May I invite the ministers to their ministerial lunch, to all of the rest of you to the Villa Gazebo, and please, as you stand up, could you show your appreciation for what has been generally an excellent morning's of debate. Thank you very much.